In the words of Nanny Og, Sunday school just got mythic with extra myth. So, let's get started. Cheers. Welcome back everybody to Sunday School, a series of videos where I'll tell you how to read fantasy, because apparently you need to know. No, my point is, this is an ongoing series where we look at different lenses through which we can read fantasy, and I'll tell you a bit about all the stuff that I know or claim to know about it, and at the end of the day, hopefully, you'll have more fun reading fantasy or can actually bore people with lots of facts at parties, which is really, really helpful. Anyway, today we're talking about The Wandering Fire by Gavriel K, and we're talking about mythology. And as I just hinted, there may be a second edition on mythology next week. So, yeah, you don't have to read The Darkest Road yet, unless you feel like it. We'll see how that goes, but yeah, that would be the third book, and that part would be talking about psychology and philosophy, but I feel a second edition on mythology might be needed, because there's a lot to talk about, and we don't want to have this thing go like 2.5 hours or whatever, right? Anyway, let's talk about mythology, fantasy, and The Wandering Fire as an example. I might also mention stuff that happened in the first book, The Summer Tree. Ready? Perfect. All right. Now let's start with an issue that I have. A lot of times people go like, well, the history of fantasy starts with mythology, and that is not necessarily correct. I would argue it is absolutely wrong, unless you have a very specific view of what literature is. So let's look at that for a moment and try to make some definitions and stuff. Mythology as a thing, or myth as a thing, as we will look at from now on, is, well, is hard to define, and only comes up as like a subject of study, in a way, in the 18th century. And then becomes really popular in the 19th century. And we'll talk a bit about that history today and how things were used. So, let's define mythology. And we'll go back to the Brothers Grimm, because we have to. See, there's the idea that there's a lot of like oral traditions, stories that have been told over and over again. And that's sort of where we start out with. And there's different versions of that, right? There's, according to the Brothers Grimm, there's like 3 different versions of oral tradition, which they collected in the 19th century. And these are tales, which in German they call Märchen, which is a very specific form of tale, which we usually call fairy tale in English. The second part is legends, which they called Sage. And the third part is myth, which is, well, mythos. See, there's a difference with all these. Fairy tales are very specific folk tales about stuff with a very specific moral at the end of it, oftentimes kind of comic and so forth. Those are what you call fairy tales, right? Now, there's legends. Legends are stories that explain things very often. Local things. You know, those might be stories that you tell about why a specific hill got a specific name, why a specific place is called that way, about a local hero that did something fun or not so fun. Those kind of things are legends on like a local or regional level. And then there's myths. Myths are stories that explain, or try to explain, why the big ones, right? See why the world exists, how the world exists, why things work the way they work in our existence. They are the big stories, which may or may not be religions at the end of the day, or build into religions. We'll talk about that in a moment for just a brief time, because we'll have to come back to that later, I guess. So that is the definitions that we'll have here. So while we have stories that may or may not be myths, they may be legends. And this 3-tier model is obviously not perfect, and other options are out there, but I feel it works for today. And today we'll mostly talk about myth and what, you know, comes to that kind of myth. Now, obviously, the most famous mythologies, if you grow up in the West, are the classic Greek or Greco-Roman, mostly Greek myths. The Romans mostly adapted those later on. And the Celtic myths and the Norse myths, or Norse mythology, which you find in the Eddas and so forth. And they've been around for a long time, especially the Greek ones. And see what happens after a while when these myths are no longer perpetuated in an oral tradition, they are written down, right? And they become something else. And that's the first bit that we need to remember for what is happening today, and when we get closer to the connection between fantasy and mythology. See, once they are written down, they become a toolbox. They become a set of things we can use. Tolkien talks about the cauldron of story, where all these story elements are lobbed in. That is in his On Fairy Stories essay. But there's more to that. And that is, we use a lot of words that are from myths, or we use allusions to mythical things. We talk about an Achilles heel. We talk about, things like that. We use something and call it hermetically sealed, which, guess where that comes from? Stuff like that, right? We have a lot of these connections, rhetorical devices, and so forth. If, gods beware, you plan to be a poet, or you were a poet in, say, the 19th century or the 18th century, or even before, making allusions to mythologies was part of what you did was part of poetic language. And that's something that happens a lot. So using elements from mythology for, later creations of art is part of the process of, turning oral stories into something that spreads throughout, I don't want to call it a collective unconscious yet. We may go there later on, but that's sort of what happens. They become part of what you nowadays would call pop culture, or, cultural awareness in a way, and are used for that. And you find that with a lot of collections of these kind of stories, of mythologies. Oftentimes they are, in fact, written down by someone as a, manual for poets, for these kind of people to learn these things. As an example, the Edda would work. Snorri Sturluson wrote that thing to collect these mythic builds, so Icelandic poets who were relying on that could use those pagan stories for their craft afterwards, because at the time he wrote them down, Iceland had more or less fully converted, or officially at least converted, to Christianity. So the Edda is basically a handbook for poets where they can look up all these stories about Thor and Odin and all of that stuff to then use to tell stories, use them for whatever else later on in their bardic poetry, which is, fine. So that's a first way of how myth enters literature or art, because myth at its core is more. As I said, these are stories that help us to understand the world. They explain the world. They may even bring us to do certain actions, which may be called rituals, which is, where the idea of religion kind of comes from. In that regard, yes, you can read the Bible as just another myth. We'll probably get there at some point as well. So, our first step is oral traditions, stories of different levels of importance, either just being funny stories that follow a specific formula to have a very specific, moral at the end of the day, or are just funny stories. Animal fables kind of come also into that area. The lowest, when it comes to power level, I guess, form of that. The next one is legends that are about certain happenings that, are tied to a very specific place. And the third are myths, which are stories that explain or answer or try to answer universal questions. And they can be, collected, written down, and then used as tools in other things. Another part is myths are relatively short. They are basically a collection of things that happen, Heracles gets these tasks that he needs to do, and then you just list what he does. He goes, kills animals, diverts streams, that kind of stuff. Just Herculean tasks. And that's the myth. At its core, you can write down these kind of myths in very short, paragraphs. It's like, a guy goes to get himself a piece of sheep hide. He takes a boat, rides around the Black Sea, finds a wife and comes back. That's the Argonauts. It's short. And that's why myths work that well, because every individual artist, every individual poet, every individual bard, whatever you want to call these kind of people, can perform then in individual ways. So the core story, the myth core, is relatively small, and we, then embellish on that. Case in point, if you look at Greek tragedy, a lot of those are bits and pieces from stuff that shows up in the Odyssey and the Iliad, which are already collections of oral poems that, there's no Homer who wrote all of that down. It was a bunch of people that after a while collected all these stories that they were already performing, and then you go to Greek tragedy, who pick individual parts and bits out of that and turn them into, plays on a stage. And there's one key thing that happens in this regard, which we will call myth retelling for now, and we'll not go too deeply into it today, because today we're talking about mythology on a grander scale. What do I mean? Well, they add inner monologues. They add character to the characters. See, in that core of the tasks of Heracles, we don't know what Heracles is thinking. We don't care what Heracles is thinking. In the core of, say, the story of Oedipus, what we learn is Oedipus gets, there's a bad prophecy. Oedipus gets dropped with a shepherd. He comes back, kills his father, sleeps with his mom. And answers a really dumb riddle. And then he finds out and, dies, sadly. So there you go. But when you when you watch the different plays that people like Sophocles and Aeschylus and so forth wrote, suddenly there's a lot of layers there. Characters become nuanced. We know what they feel, or we learn what certain Greeks thought they felt, and so forth. And that is something that we find today with myth retellings as well. We take the core story, and we add our own interpretation, our own lens, and move beyond. That's the strength of myths in that regard, as something that we have probably connected to before, and we can then use it to embellish, add depth, or connect to an audience with our own interpretations of that. So far, so good. Now we come to the next bit. World building and depth. See, fantasy, especially the kind of fantasy that we're talking about right now, which is a secondary world fantasy where someone built a world, like Tolkien did, or like Gavriel does with Fionawar right now. Well, you invent a world, and those are kind of difficult to do, because what you want is not just a description of a landscape or whatever, but you want to add depth of history, of mythology, stories that make this world feel real, that add layers, like a feeling of time that has passed before our characters ever come to that place. That's what you want to add. Now, you can obviously go and write that shit down and explain and, build it from the ground up. Someone like Stephen Erickson and Cam Asselman did that for the Malazan world. But you can also, take some shortcuts in a way. Tolkien did that from time to time. Gavriel does it more here in Fiona, which is why I looked at this one for now. See, what you can do is you can take some myths and bits of mythology and, take them, because they are often very ubiquitous, and we find them in all kinds of, stories all over the place. So you can take these elements and you can put them into your fantasy world. Case in point with Fionawar. There's a lot of elements in here that we know from mythology, especially, the pantheon, elements that happen throughout the story. For example, when, Paul gets bound to the summer tree, what happens, at the end of the day, he hears two ravens, Thought and Memory. And that's a very popular translation for Hugin and Munin, which are the, ravens that follow around Odin. Now, Odin spent some time on a tree. It was an ash tree, not an oak, but, there's the thing, to learn wisdom. So there's a motif that people that have heard about Norse mythology before can sort of recognize. But Gavriel goes beyond that. See, he does use some elements of Celtic mythology. We'll talk about that in a moment. He does use some elements of Greek mythology. Case in point, Kevin Lane's storyline with the sacrifice is very close to Adonis, the myth of Adonis, who dies in the arms of the goddess of love. Now, there's going to be more mixing and matching here, which is sort of my point. Names, I just said, like, there's Celtic mythology in here. Like, there's a goddess called Dana. Now, those of you who have, looked into Irish mythology may remember that name. He just takes that as a mother goddess. We'll go deeper in a moment, but there's that. And through all of these elements, Gavriel K builds a pantheon that always feels vaguely familiar. And he's very clever about that. See, in this world, the story is called, the character is called Liadon. And that sounds vaguely Celtic, right? It sounds vaguely Celtic. But it's also Adon from Adonis, and he just adds that Lee before it to make it sound more Celtic. Another one is Liralan, the god of the sea. Now, there is obviously the Celtic god of the sea, Manannán mac Lir, the Irish god of the sea, but he also has, in his appearance and stuff, he's much closer to what you might call Poseidon, in a way. So he does once again mix different things in that regard, and gives them a sense of familiarity. We read the book, and if we, heard of any of these kinds of mythologies, of pantheons, this stuff will sound vaguely familiar. And we, as readers, do the hard work. We add that feeling of depth of time to it. It's like, yeah, that makes sense. So that's one way that he does, that Guy Gavriel K uses mythology and legendary to build his world. And that's the sort of implicit kind of thing. He goes beyond that in two ways. One is he uses the study of mythology to do something here, and one is he takes one explicit mythology, or a legend in this case, a cycle of legends, a circle of legends, that is a corpus of legends that's obviously Arthuriana. And that's the two things that we'll need to talk about today before we leave. The study of mythology. Now, as I said, from the 18th century onwards, people have started to study mythology for all kinds of reasons, and we'll talk about them possibly next week. Some of them were very nationalistic in goal, but at the other end, there's also the idea of ritual. The idea of, like, why do people believe certain things? And that's the field of anthropology. Now, the major text in that regard, although it's obviously not true and has, been, abandoned by anthropology by now, is The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer. It was published in 1890 and in different editions later on. And Frazer does something very interesting. He goes around and looks at mythologies from all over the place, and he tries to fit them into a pattern and tries to collect, also certain rites that are still performed, folklore and stuff like that, and tries to come up with a fundamental story, fundamental religion. See, the point is to find out what people believed before they had, the Greek pantheon. What did the original Indo-Europeans, or whatever you want to call them, believe? And Frazer comes up with this idea of a nature goddess, or two of them, a mother goddess, Earth Mother, and a dying and possibly being reborn god or god king. It goes into all kinds of details there, but you can see something here, and that had a huge impact. See, these ideas. As I said, Frazer's wrong. It's still a good book to read if you want to, have that influence. Another author, a poet, fittingly, Robert Graves, he also wrote some really interesting and fun historical novels like I, Claudius, wrote a book called The White Goddess, where he takes all these ideas, adds his personal beliefs and poet's sensibilities to it, and creates that story of the primal mother goddess, the triple goddess, the threefold goddess, right? Mother, maiden, crone, whatever you want to call them. That kind of goddess. And from all of these ideas springs a sort of belief or system of how the world may have worked in the olden days, of having a male sky god and a female earth goddess, and how that builds that belief of the circle of life, of the circle of the year, of birth and, death and rebirth for the male god, through the mother goddess, and so forth. Now, is that what people originally believed? I don't know. We will never find out, but it sounds good. And through people like Graves, that was made very popular through the neo-pagan, more like Celtic neo-pagan Wicca movement. It was made even more popular. And it's something that we find in this world, in Fionnavar. Because, see, Mornir is the male sky god, and Donna is the female earth goddess, which does work in threes, as you may or may not remember from the text. So we have these allusions in there, and those are not necessarily found in mythology, but they're found in the scholarship of mythology, in anthropology, and then later on poetry with someone like Robert Graves. And we find these elements. Mornir is male. The sky lore that Mornir brought is magic that men use, whereas female magic is tied to the earth root, and blood. It does, once again, add a layer of verisimilitude, I guess, to the world building here, because we've all heard these ideas somewhere. We've encountered these ideas of like a male sky god and a female earth goddess. The mother maiden Kronbit, we find it, say in Westeros, in the Sept, the seven gods of the Septim, whatever it's called, religion. We have these ideas. We've encountered them somewhere before. So when we read them in this book and they have different names, we're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. It rounds out the world without the author having to do a shitload of world building and writing out notes and explanations and stuff, because we can fill in the details. Now we come to the last part, Arthuriana. See, there's one important element here, and that is how do we as humans connect to stories, to mythology, to legends. And there's a bunch of ways. One is the memorata, which means that we have a personal experience in some way or other, some personal connection to stories and mythologies. And Guy Gavriel K uses that in a way. We have, our main characters, our main five, or four at this point, are characters from our world, from Toronto. They move to Fionnavar, and then, Jennifer discovers that she's in truth Guinevere, however you pronounce her name in whatever language, right? She's Guinevere, the love interest of Arthur and Lancelot. And suddenly we have a connection to the Arthurian story, which is one of the, most popular, legend corpuses out there. So he just explicitly drops in Arthuriana, and he takes some very specific elements of Arthur, and we'll maybe talk about Arthur some more next week. But what we find here is which Arthur does he take? Well, there's the idea of the Child Slayer, which is a short episode from, the first book of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which is about, Arthur killing a bunch of kids because he has a prophecy that the kid that he fathered on his sister, Mordred, will, kill him and destroy the world and so forth. So he does the thing that you do as a king in that regard. We're like, I'll kill all the kids born on that day. Sounds familiar? Well, it's also what King Herod does, and there's probably a connection there in the creation. Who knows? Mythologies do sometimes resemble each other, which does not mean that there is a monomyth. Just saying as some foreshadowing for later. However, it's a fairly obscure bit that gets rarely reused in other Arthurian retellings. It's in this one. So he uses that to build up that whole idea that the love triangle with Lancelot is foregone, is foreseen or done by the Weaver to do all these things, to force that on as a punishment for Arthur, which is, is a clever way to build all that in. And then he connects it to one of our characters, who is, Jennifer in this case, the reborn, or this version in this world of Guinevere. And that's a very clever way to build the whole thing up, because now he can use and do the thing that I just talked about earlier, which is myth retelling. He can do that and give us the personalities of that he uses for Lancelot and Arthur and Guinevere, or in this case Jennifer, and we have a connection that is much closer in a way than it would be if it was just another Arthurian retelling. And that's a fairly interesting way of doing that. Another source that you can find here is some of the terms they come from the Celtic, from the Welsh, from the Mabinogion, which is, for example, the ship Prydwen is mentioned there, and the dog Caval, which are two terms that I have not encountered in other Arthurian versions, at least not in Mallory and so forth. So I assume that's sort of where they came from originally. So we have this connection. We have the connection to the cauldron, obviously, which is another part of like Welsh mythology of the Mabinogion, with the cauldron that can revive people, but they are dumb afterwards. They are mute. They can't talk afterwards. But he does take all of these elements and he binds them together. He does one thing more that I feel is important to mention here, and that is, once again, the idea with well, he has other terms here like the Ljósalfar and the Svartalfar, which are taken from Norse mythology, from the Edda, although the Svartalfar are not called Svartalfar there, which would be like black elves. They're called dark Alfar in a way. I don't know how to pronounce it, which are the dark elves. But so he takes that from Norse mythology, builds it in his like idea of like how he builds, fantasy species in here, which is clever. And he takes the idea that the elves move to the west, which gets a very terrible twist in this book, but he takes that from Tolkien. And that, I think, is an important element here. It's like one of the two things that we need to talk about before we leave it for today. See, what he does here is he takes parts of Lord of the Rings and the Middle-earth mythos, so to speak, and he treats them in his world-building, in his connection, very much like another mythology. And I think that's an important aspect, because while Tolkien wrote his stuff as a form of mythology for England, Guy Gavriel Kay does treat it as a mythology in that regard. And what that shows us is that it is possible to create new myths and use them as myths, because myth, unlike fantasy, in a way, is very much alive, because its goal is to answer these big questions in a way. And I found this very, very interesting. One final thing that I'll just mention for today, we'll talk about it more in the future, is the Dalrai. And that's fascinating. See, the Dalrai as a culture from the outside look very much like Native Americans, right? They're like Plains American natives, right? They ride around, they hunt antelopes in this case, but still, and so forth. They have like tribal structure, they have tribes, they have shamans, that kind of stuff, which is an interesting alternative to what we see with Tolkien, who picks his riding group, which are the Rohirrim, which are very much based on ancient Anglo-Saxons, even by the names and stuff like that. So we change that, which makes sense. See, I mean, Guy Gavriel Kay is a Canadian, so he takes something from his continent there. And I appreciate that. We have like similarities. There's the myth of like that ride of the Dalrai, which is very much like the ride of the Rohirrim, either the one of Eorl the Young or the one of Theoden later in Lord of the Rings. But, it's done by a different group. However, and this I think is something that I really appreciate in Guy Gavriel Kay, there's a problem with taking mythology. See, mythologies are something that is usually tied to identity, to cultural identity in a lot of ways. And the fun bit, so to speak, or the easy bit about, say, Norse mythology, or Greek mythology, or even Celtic mythology, although there's, connections with Welsh mythology that may make it a bit difficult, I guess. But the point here is, those are mostly forgotten, overcome places, overcome mythologies. They are the stories of a people that does no longer exist. The ancient Norse don't exist. The ancient Greeks don't exist. The Romans are gone in that regard. However, with other groups that are still around, especially, native groups that have suffered intensely under colonialism and imperialism, but these myths are very much tied to their identity. And a white author just grabbing those native myths and using them in their book may be considered a lot of bad things, including cultural appropriation. So Guy Gavriel Kay gives these people, the Dalrai, still, it's sort of his made-up, religion, the same religion. They just worship other gods in that same pantheon. So he avoids well, culturally appropriating and probably getting it wrong, myths of Native Americans, which I think is a very, it's a good approach to the whole idea, like adding like an American or North American element in how the world feels without actually encroaching on those identities is probably the best way you can do it in that regard. So, where does all of that leave us for now? Well, mythologies or myths are, well, oral stories that have been written down at some point or are continually, being written down nowadays as well. They're oral stories, they have a fixed kernel, and are then elaborated by individual storytellers. They deal with the huge questions, if we call them myths. They deal with local stories, origin stories of names and stuff like that, if we call them legends. And they are just, fundamental basic stories, if you call them fairy tales, that are either there for our education or entertainment. We can use those myths by slightly alienating them, slightly changing them, to build a sense of breadth or depth of time and depth of world building, which is what a lot of fantasy authors do. We could blend different of these mythologies, which is what Gavriel does, by, switching around names, taking different stories and integrating them into one pantheon, which does feel familiar and correct. We can take individual stories and also do the same thing, which is what he does with the Cauldron, for example. And we can, use specific legends and adapt them, infusing them with our own characteristics, our own, conventions of the written narrative, which are, as I said, characterization, things like that, which is what Gavriel does with the Arthurian legend. He takes different aspects of the Arthurian story and builds his own story that will be important for his narrative here. And to connect us with them, he uses what you might call a memorata, which is having one of the contemporary characters of this book, Jennifer, be directly, personally connected to the Arthurian legend. Now, where will all of that lead in the future? Well, we need to talk some more about mythology. That's what we'll do next week. And if you want to read more up on Arthur, I can only encourage you. That might be helpful. And then we'll talk about the Darkest Road later on in, 2 weeks, I guess. Oh, and we obviously forgot to talk about the Wild Hunt, which is way more of a legend than a mythology, because it's a local thing, and it explains one very specific thing, which is, autumn storms. And it has been around in Central Europe. It may be connected to something that we'll talk about when we talk about Tigana, which is certain witch cults and things like that. But he takes this legend, I just wanted to mention it before we leave. Anyway, that's our introduction to myth, and there'll be more extra myth next week. Until then, go read up on Arthurian legend if you feel like it. Go have a good week. Don't forget to do your homework, and I'll see you to Sunday school next week. Cheers.